I remember heat before I remember fear. The reactor hall always ran too warm. The air trembled with it, a slow shimmer above the coolant pipes that made everything look a little out of focus. At first, I blamed the way my visor compensated for the radiation glare, or the way the recycled air picked up the metallic taste from the conduits. It was comfortable almost, compared to the thin chill that clung to the rest of the station. A place you could stand still for a moment and pretend the universe outside the hull wasn't empty and indifferent. That day, the warmth felt wrong. I was on inspection duty, walking the upper catwalk that circled the main reactor column. Below me, the core pulsed behind its layered shielding, a regular, reassuring heartbeat of contained violence. Normally, the vibration came up through the deck in a constant, even hum you could forget about if you stopped thinking about it. But as I walked my route, the hum seemed to lean, as if the whole hall had shifted half a degree sideways. That was impossible, of course. The hall was anchored to the spine of the refinery. The station didn't just tilt. My boots rang on the grating, each step landing a fraction earlier than I expected, like the floor wanted to meet me halfway. I paused at the midpoint of the ramp and put my gloved hand on the railing. The metal felt hotter than usual, not enough to burn, just enough that my fingers hesitated before tightening their grip. "Reactor inspection, cycle 4 complete," I reported, out of habit more than anything. My voice sounded flat in my own ears, smothered by the thick air. No one answered immediately. Comms lag was common this deep in the structure. Signal had to weave its way through too much ore, too many improvised bulkheads. I told myself that was all it was. From up here, I could see the maintenance drones gliding along their cables, small articulated frames moving with thoughtless precision. Their status lights glowed steady green. No alarms, no anomalies. The readouts on my wrist display stayed within the usual parameters: core output, coolant flow, magnetic containment. All of it neat, predictable numbers. And yet the hum under my feet continued to lean, like a held breath stretching too long. I resumed walking, finishing the loop along the catwalk. At the far end, near the service ladder, the air changed. The warmth dropped out of it between two steps, replaced by a thin, sharp cold that made the hairs rise on the back of my neck beneath the suit. My breath fogged the inside of my visor for a moment before the filters compensated. I stopped again and looked down. The reactor column remained where it should be. The glow behind the shielding plates strobed slowly, steady as a heartbeat on a monitor. But the light felt narrow, as if it had pulled in on itself, leaving more shadow around the edges of the chamber than there should have been. The far wall seemed a little farther away, the support pillars a little taller. Distances stretched, then snapped back when I focused on them. I shut my eyes, counted to 5, and opened them again. Everything looked normal. I logged a note anyway. Minor atmospheric variance in reactor hall. Recommend recalibration of thermal regulators. Clinical words, easy to dismiss later if someone reviewed the file. I didn't add the part about the way the light had seemed to retreat, or the way the cold had felt like someone had opened a hatch not to vacuum, but to something that was paying attention. On the way out, as I crossed the last span of catwalk toward the bulkhead door, the hum under my boots steadied. The warmth returned, seeping into the soles of my feet. For a second, I almost turned back, just to see if I could make the temperature swing happen again. I didn't. I told myself it was because my shift was nearly over, because you didn't go looking for extra work in a place like this. because nothing had actually failed. The door controls reacted a fraction slower than usual when I hit the panel. The status light flickered up through its sequence, amber, then green, with a hitch between the two, like it had to think about it. When the door finally cycled open, the cooler air of the main corridor washed over me. I stepped through quicker than I meant to, and only realized it when the bulkhead swung shut behind me with more force than it usually had. The sound echoed down the corridor like the station was clearing its throat. I started the walk toward the cargo bay, the next stop on my route. The corridor lights followed me in sequence, panels blooming to life overhead and fading behind. They had always done that, a power-saving feature the engineers assured us was perfectly safe. Still, I found myself counting the gaps between them, watching for any hesitation in the pattern. 2 panels in, one of them skipped. The light ahead of me stayed dark for a heartbeat, then 2, leaving a slice of corridor in shadow. My visor compensated a little, raising the gain, but for that stretched second, the darkness felt thicker than it had any right to be. The station hummed around me, all that machinery and circulation and life support wrapped in metal, and under it all, something slower, like a pulse that didn't belong to any system I knew. Then the panel flicked on. The corridor looked ordinary again. I exhaled and kept walking, telling myself that fatigue played tricks, that recycled air and long shifts wore down your senses, that all I'd really seen was a cheap sensor taking a moment to catch up. Still, as I neared the junction toward the cargo bay, I glanced back once over my shoulder. The lights behind me were spaced the way they always had been, casting regular pools along the corridor. But for an instant, just before I turned away, I had the impression that the corridor was not straight, that it bent just slightly in a way no schematic had ever shown, a gradual, patient arc, curving out of sight toward someplace the station hadn't been built to reach. I didn't log that part either. I smelled the cargo bay before I heard it. The air there always carried a heavy mix of lubricant, cold metal, and the faint organic rot of rations that had sat too long at the wrong temperature. That cycle, something sharper threaded through it. Ozone, like after a discharge, but the logs hadn't shown any recent weapon tests. The bay doors towered ahead of me, segmented armor plates sealed shut, indicator strips along their edges glowing a steady, indifferent green. Inside, the loaders were already awake. The access panel accepted my code after a slight delay that made my stomach tighten. The doors parted with their usual hydraulic sigh, but as soon as the gap was wide enough, my suit's sensors ticked up a warning about electromagnetic interference. It was low level, nothing that triggered a hard alarm, just a subtle rise in background noise across multiple bands. The cargo bay stretched out in front of me, stacked with containers and equipment pallets in neat rows. Overhead cranes slept in their rails. A pair of automated lifters moved along pre-programmed paths near the far wall, their motion precise and unbothered. Light from the overhead strips fell in clean bars, edging the stacked crates in pale silver. I stepped inside, and the interference climbed half a notch. "Cargo inspection, Sector 3, I said into the channel, picking up some minor EM fluctuation. Logging it." This time the reply came quick. "Copy Sector 3. Keep an eye on it. We've had some relay noise from that side of the station." The voice from control sounded tired, but not concerned. I took some comfort in that. If it was systemic, it was someone else's problem to solve. My job was to walk the route, check the seals, confirm the manifests. I made my way down the main aisle, boots thudding softly on the decking. Each row of crates had a numeric tag. Each tag matched a listing on my wrist display. I checked for mismatches, unreported shifts, unauthorized access. The interference stayed with me. A fine, constant hiss at the edge of hearing that wasn't quite sound. When I turned into the second aisle, my right hand twitched. It wasn't much, just a brief, involuntary flex of the fingers inside the glove. I paused and looked down, watching my own hand like it belonged to someone else. The muscle had gone tight across the back of it, a faint tremor running from knuckle to wrist. I consciously unclenched, shook it out once, twice, tried to pin the sensation on fatigue. I reached out to steady myself against the side of a crate. The impact felt slightly misaligned, like my hand had met the metal half a second before I expected it to. I blinked and did it again, slower this time, palm to container wall, cold, textured steel under the suit's material. No delay, no lag. The interference ticked up once more. At the end of the aisle, the security field around the restricted section shimmered faintly, marking the border with an invisible curtain my visor reminded me not to cross. Inside that cordoned-off zone sat the pieces we weren't supposed to have. Contraband tech, anomalous finds from the mining tunnels, and the relics the higher-ups pretended not to care about while routing them through our station anyway. I stopped just outside the barrier and pulled up the log. No unauthorized access, no tampering. The field reported stable power draw. Still, something pressed on my eardrums there. A thin pressure like I'd just descended too fast in an atmosphere. The EM hiss in my sensors rose in pitch, becoming a needle-fine whine that shrank into the back of my skull. I swallowed and felt my throat move, dry against dry. I told myself to take the readings and move on. The relic crates sat low to the ground, reinforced casings wrapped in additional containment harnesses. Most of them looked like any other secure cargo. One of them didn't. Someone had stenciled a symbol on its side in glowing paint, a concession to the scientists who needed their own markers beyond simple serial codes. The symbol meant nothing to me. Angular lines and curves that refused to settle into any alphabet I recognized. My right hand twitched again as I looked at it. The sensation this time wasn't just a tremor. For a moment, as my gaze traced the painted lines, I had the distinct impression of another configuration for my hand, a way the bones and tendons should arrange themselves to mirror the shape on the crate. Like my fingers wanted to fold into some precise pattern I didn't have words for. A ghost position, layered over my real one. I flexed my hand hard until my knuckles ached. The phantom arrangement faded, leaving only a dull soreness in my joints. "Field integrity nominal," I said, my voice thinner than I liked. "No signs of breach." "Logged," Control answered. "Once you're done, swing by the scrubber chamber. We've had a CO2 variance. Probably just a sensor drift." Probably. The word did a lot of work on this station. I turned away from the restricted zone and continued down the aisle. The interference receded as I walked, a reluctant tide pulling back. My hand steadied. The muscles in my forearm burned briefly, like they'd been overused without my knowledge, then settled into a manageable ache. At the far end of the bay, I paused and looked back. From this distance, the symbol on the relic crate was just a smear of faint light. The security field was invisible from this angle, a patch of ordinary air between stacks of ordinary cargo. The loaders traced their paths in smooth arcs, ignoring the forbidden section as thoroughly as their programming required. Even at that remove, the sense of pressure on my eardrums didn't fully leave. On my way out of the bay, the doors closed a little too quickly behind me. The segments came together with a firmness that wasn't quite a slam, but suggested impatience. The EM noise on my display dropped immediately once the seals engaged, like whatever had been leaking out in there had been cut off with surgical precision. I stood for a moment in the outer corridor, breathing recycled air and listening to the more familiar noises of the station. A distant thrum from the pumps, the muted rumble of ore carts a few decks away, the faint stress creaks that came from any structure bolted to vacuum. They sounded reassuring after the quiet insistence of the cargo bay. My hand curled once more at my side, as if remembering the almost shape it had tried to form. This time I didn't have to force it to unclench. It relaxed on its own, fingers spreading in the thin light of the corridor. It felt irrationally like something else had let go of it. I logged the EM fluctuation, the minor sensor noise, the recommendation for follow-up. I did not log the way my hand had tried to become something else in the presence of a symbol I couldn't read. There was no box for that in the reporting templates. The air in the scrubber chamber always tasted used. The scrubber stacks hummed in a low, overlapping murmur, a constant whisper at the edge of hearing. That cycle, the whispering was out of sync. I stepped through the access hatch, and my visor overlay flickered, briefly losing the labels it projected onto the machinery. The world snapped back a half-second later, tags reappearing over pressure gauges and intake valves. The CO2 variance control had flagged, glowed yellow in the corner of my view, a drifting line that had slid above the acceptable band. The floor here was a metal grate suspended between the stacks, with narrow walkways wrapping around the columns. I could feel the draft pulling past my boots, moving upward as the system drew air through the filters. Normally it was steady. Now it came in pulses, like breath held and released by something thinking about it. Scrubber chamber, on site, I reported, confirming variance. Copy, Control said. We've had some minor headaches on the lower decks. Just make sure we're not suffocating anyone. I moved deeper between the stacks. As I walked, the spacing between the columns felt wrong. I knew they'd been bolted in place to precise specifications. You didn't improvise with life support. But as I passed between two of the towers, the gap seemed to narrow around me. My shoulder brushed a casing that shouldn't have been that close. I stopped and turned sideways, pressing my back against one of the stacks to measure the distance. When I reached out with my free hand, the opposite column was a good arm's length away. Enough room to walk without touching. I stood there longer than necessary, my spine picking up the slow vibration of the scrubber unit. Each mechanical swallow of air felt stretched, as if the machine were reluctant to take another breath. CO2 levels? Control prompted. Within tolerance, trending down, I said. The variance line had dipped back toward the safe band. Might have been a calibration drift. It should have reassured me. Problems that fixed themselves rarely did so here. I climbed a short ladder to the upper walkway that circled the chamber. From there, I could look down over the tops of the stacks, watching faint threads of processed air rising toward the vents. The far wall was lined with access ports and a few older inspection panes. Halfway along the walkway, my reflection caught my eye. One pane used reinforced glass that had dulled over the years. The way the light hit it turned it into a warped mirror. As I passed, the movement of my suit flickered there. I turned and faced it. For a moment, everything synced the way it should. My helmet, my shoulders, the outline of my arms moving with me. Then, as I shifted my weight to take another step, the reflection hesitated. It was small, less than half a heartbeat, I felt my foot lift, felt the muscle in my calf tighten, but in the glass my leg stayed where it was. Then it lurched forward to catch up, motion compressed into a stutter that made my stomach flip. I stopped. My reflected self did too, after a delay I could count. The scrubber hum climbed around me, stacking layers of sound that weren't quite mechanical. For an instant, I had the impression of another presence crowded into the same skin, someone else testing how to move my limbs. I raised my right hand. In the glass, my hand followed, but the fingers spread wider, just slightly, more than the joints should comfortably allow. The distortion might have been the curve of the pain, but my palm tingled, the ghost of the configuration it had tried to adopt in the cargo bay returning. More insistent now. Shapes pressed against the inside of my bones. Diagrams I didn't know. I dropped my hand. The reflection took an extra beat to do the same. When it finally did, the motion looked reluctant, like something resisting being put away. "Scrubber variance resolved?" Control asked. I checked the readings. The CO2 line had slipped neatly back into the center of the safe band. Flow rates and pressure looked clean. By every metric, the system behaved exactly as it should have. "Readings are nominal," I said. "You can clear the alert." "Copy. Continue your route." The channel clicked off. I looked at the glass again. My reflection looked ordinary now. When I raised my hand this time, the gesture matched perfectly, fingers spreading to a normal span. One level below, air moved through the stacks. As I watched, a faint column of flow bent, pulled sideways by a draft that shouldn't have existed. It leaned toward the inspection pane, toward the glass, like smoke being drawn toward a hidden source. The back of my neck prickled. At the far side of the chamber, a hatch led into the comms relay spine, a narrow maintenance corridor that ran along the station's back, housing the antenna controls and signal processors. It was my next stop. I crossed the walkway more quickly than I meant to, hand resting on the latch. Behind my ribs, my own breath felt borrowed. For a moment, I had the sensation of being inside a lung. Not metaphorically, literally inside something much larger than the station, moving air for it, keeping its blood gases in balance. We were just cells clinging to the inside of a rib. The thought didn't feel like mine. I closed my fingers around the hatch handle. My hand obeyed, but there was a brief double sensation, like a second set of muscles wanted to pull in a different direction. I forced the motion through. The hatch opened. As I stepped into the comm spine, the scrubber chamber door swung shut behind me with the soft finality of someone ending a conversation. The noise changed instantly. The low whisper of the filters gave way to the tighter hum of signal equipment. Cable trunks climbed one wall. Small maintenance screens glowed on the other, showing the station's links to the outside. As I moved down the spine, one of the status screens flickered. For an instant, the stream of numbers vanished, replaced by a pattern of pale lines that hurt to look at. They twisted in on themselves, sharp and flowing at once, like the symbol on the relic crate expanded into all three dimensions and then flattened again. My vision blurred, my knees locked. The pattern snapped back to ordinary diagnostics before my brain finished parsing it. In that stretched moment, I had the sense of something looking back through the system. Something not on any ship or world, but close. Close enough that if I turned fast enough, I might see it standing in the narrow corridor with me. I didn't turn. I kept walking, each step measured, boots landing where I told them to. The hum of the equipment pressed against my eardrums. My reflection in the faint gloss of a nearby panel moved with me in perfect time. I didn't give it a chance to fall behind. The comm spine bled straight into the observation level, and the air changed again as I climbed. Up here, the station always felt thinner. The bulk of the refinery dropped away beneath you, leaving only the narrow ribs and antenna housings between you and vacuum. The hum of machinery spread out, losing that deep enclosing pressure. Instead, a higher nervous vibration took over. The chatter of transmitters, the tick of tracking servos, the faint grind when the station corrected its attitude by a fraction of a degree. I emerged onto the observation deck with my shoulders already tight. The deck was generous terminology. It was a cramped platform wrapped around a slit of armored glass, just wide enough for two people to stand side by side if they didn't mind touching. The glass looked out over the hull and the starfield beyond. In theory, it allowed maintenance staff to visually confirm antenna alignment during outages. In practice, it served as a place to remind yourself why you didn't unclip your tether outside. Today, the starfield looked wrong. I stepped up to the slit. My visor dimmed automatically, polarizing against the hard points of light. The hull stretched away beneath the window, a long curve of metal broken by protruding antenna clusters and sensor masts. Beyond that, blackness sprinkled with distant suns, the faint haze of a nebula at the edge of vision. Except the nebula wasn't where it should have been. I'd spent enough nights up here to memorize that patch of sky, a smudge of pale blue gas, a slightly brighter star just below it. Nothing dramatic. Now the smudge had slid upward by a degree or two, like someone had dragged it with a fingertip. The star sat a little farther from it, as if the distance between them had been stretched. The station hadn't moved that much. It couldn't. I checked the external attitude readings. The numbers stayed solid, drifting within expected limits. No sudden shift, no spin, no anomalies. Behind the glass, the stars continued their slow, patient rearrangement. For a few seconds, I tried to blame the glass. Armor panes could warp subtly over time under tension and thermal stress. Maybe the curvature had changed. Maybe the alignment marks weren't perfectly centered. The rational explanations lined up neatly, and none of them registered with the animal part of my brain that had gone cold. A maintenance notice flashed in my visor. Minor antenna offset, EVA walkway inspection recommended. Of course. Observation level online, I reported. Visual shows possible attitude drift. Systems disagree. I'm going out on the walkway to confirm antenna alignment. Control hesitated before acknowledging. Copy. EVA tether checks required. Log any variance. The hatch to the external walkway sat to the right of the slit, a small, unassuming door that might as well have been the edge of the world. I ran through the tether checks automatically. Harness attachment, line integrity, anchor points. Everything came back clean. When the hatch cycled open, the station's internal sounds fell away, leaving only the close hiss of my suit systems. The walkway extended along the hull as a narrow spine of metal, grating underfoot, safety line clips glinting at regular intervals. Beyond its edge, space waited with indifferent patience. My first step onto the grating landed heavier than I intended. The magnets in my boots thudded against the metal, gripping more firmly than necessary. For a heartbeat, I had the sensation that the hull had risen to meet me. I clipped onto the safety line and started down the walkway. The antennas loomed ahead, skeletal structures bristling with dishes and rods. Their outlines looked softened somehow, edges not quite where my eyes insisted they should be. The star field behind them flexed and unflexed, as if the universe had developed a slow, deep breath. Halfway to the first antenna cluster, gravity flickered. It wasn't a loss of weight, not exactly. It was a sideways slip, a moment where the pull of the hull shifted a few degrees, urging me toward the edge instead of straight down. My stomach lurched. My right foot landed too close to the railing, boot scraping metal. The tether line tightened sharply as my balance tilted. For an instant, my body wanted to continue, to lean into the new pull and step out into the void. The station's artificial gravity reasserted itself with a jolt, snapping back to its proper vector. I staggered, braced a hand on the railing, and forced my breathing to slow. "Minor gravity fluctuation on EVA walkway," I said, because not saying anything would have been worse. "Stabilized now. No attitude alarm triggers." Control's reply came after a beat too long. "We don't show any fluctuation on our side. Might be a local field anomaly. Proceed with caution." Local anomaly. A tidy phrase for the feeling that the hull itself had leaned toward emptiness. I reached the first antenna cluster and ran the usual checks. Physical alignment, within tolerance. Servo response, nominal. Power draw, normal. Signal lag, higher than expected, but not enough to explain what I'd seen on the observation slit. As I circled the structure, tightening clamps that didn't need it, and checking mounts that had not shifted, something moved along the hull below me. Not movement, exactly. Light. The starfield's reflection on the metal skin of the station bent, forming a narrow, elongated shadow where nothing protruded. It was a shape defined not by edges, but by absence. A vertical distortion the size of a person, walking parallel to the walkway a few meters out from the hull. For a second, I thought it was my own shadow, warped by the antenna. But my position didn't line up. My own silhouette, what little of it I could see in the scattered highlights, stayed close to my boots. This other absence walked in lockstep with me, just beyond the safety line, its outline rippling as the stars behind it shifted. I froze. The distortion continued a step or two, then stopped as well. We stood there together, me pressed against the antenna strut, whatever it was suspended over nothing, carved out of bent light. The stars around it seemed to hesitate, their slow drift pausing, then resuming along new paths that threaded carefully around the outline. My tether line trembled. "I'm experiencing some visual refraction on the hull surface," I said, choosing each word with care. "Could be a sensor artifact in the visor, recording." My voice sounded distant in my own ears. The distortion shifted. Not toward me, not yet. It leaned just slightly, as if considering the walkway. The suggestion of a curve at its upper end hinted at a head that never quite formed. The lower portion narrowed where legs might have been, but there was no clear separation. Just a slow, deliberate stretching of absence. Then, near the top of the shape, light caught on something that should not have been there. It was a sliver, no more than a crescent of brightness, hanging in midair at the level of a raised arm. It had the clean, sharp quality of a blade catching a distant sun. The hull's reflected star field bent around it too, warping as if skirting an electric edge. The thing did not step closer. It didn't need to. The vector between us was already clear, a straight line from my chest through vacuum to that patient outline. My left hand had clenched on the antenna strut without my permission. I forced my fingers to relax, one at a time. The motion felt delayed, as if my muscles were waiting for a second opinion before obeying. "Alignment confirmed," I said. though I wasn't looking at the antenna anymore. No mechanical deviation, returning inside. The distortion didn't follow as I backed away. It stayed where it was, hanging over the hull, the hint of a blade glint lingering at its edge. As I retreated along the walkway, it seemed to fold back into the starfield, its outline dissolving into a pattern of lights that refused to settle into random positions. By the time I reached the hatch, the nebula had returned to approximately where it had always been. The stars looked almost right again. Almost. I cycled back into the observation level and waited for the hatch to seal. The sound of the latches engaging felt like a thin barrier between two incompatible maps of reality. EVA concluded, I reported. No actionable hardware faults found. Copy, Control said. We're still seeing occasional signal jitter. Might be external interference. We'll log it with the sector relay. External interference. I looked once more at the slit, at the stars that now behaved themselves, and thought, not external, not really. Whatever had walked beside the hull hadn't felt like an outside force. It had felt like something that had always been there, waiting for us to notice. The medbay smelled too clean to be trustworthy. Sterile wipes, reprocessed water, and the faint tang of copper from stored blood mixed into something that never quite felt like air. After the recycled exhaust of the scrubber chamber and the metallic dryness of the comm spine, the medbay's filtered neutrality should have been a relief. Instead, it reminded me of all the things the systems were working to scrub out. Protocol said that any EVA after an anomaly warranted a checkup. Control didn't argue. Neither did I. I sat on the edge of the examination cot in my undersuit, while the medtech ran scanners over my chest and head. The suit lay folded on a nearby bench, its outer shell still carrying a faint dusting of station grime. My boots rested neatly beside it. Bare feet on cold medbay metal made me feel smaller than I liked. Heart rate slightly elevated, the medtech murmured, eyes on the display. No surprise there. You've had a busy shift. I made a non-committal sound. The medbay lights were brighter than most of the station, sharp white panels inset into the ceiling. Their reflection pooled on the metal fixtures, concentrated on the diagnostic equipment. The monitor above my head showed my vital signs in neatly climbing and falling lines. Heart rate, respiration, blood oxygen, a few neurometrics I never pretended to understand. As I watched, a second set of lines ghosted briefly across the screen. They were faint, a half-opacity echo that didn't quite match the timing of my own. Where my heartbeat spiked, the echo lagged. Where my breath leveled out, the shadow trace rose for an extra cycle before settling. I blinked. The extra lines vanished. "You're seeing anything unusual?" the medtech asked, not looking up. "Just tired," I said. Walkway grav felt off. "Yeah, I've got a note here about a reported fluctuation. Your muscle tension's up." The scanner passed over my right arm. "Any pain?" "Just soreness." As if on cue, my right forearm twitched, muscle fibers tightening along the bone. It felt like a cramp that had almost been something else, a rearrangement not just of flesh, but of intent. The lingering sensation of my hand wanting to shift into that impossible configuration returned, stronger now. The medtech frowned. "That hurt?" "No," I said, "just jumpy." He nodded and moved on, satisfied with the answer. Above us, the monitor showed a brief desynchronization between the heart rate line and the respiration rhythm. For 2 beats, they parted ways. my lungs drawing breath out of step with my pulse. The echo trace returned, this time hovering between them like a mediator. My chest felt tight. Not from lack of air. The medbay had plenty. It was the quality of the breath that bothered me. Each inhale felt fractionally delayed, like my diaphragm waited for a signal before moving. An approval. "Take a deep one for me," the medtech said. I tried. My ribs expanded, but the motion stuttered halfway through. The impulse to breathe originated somewhere I didn't recognize, a decision made a fraction outside myself and delivered late. For a second, my body hung between inhale and exhale, a puppet whose strings had been crossed. Then the breath completed itself, leaving behind the echo of someone else's cadence in my chest. On the monitor, the shadow trace synced perfectly with that breath, while my own line played catch-up. "Good," the medtech said. "Lungs sound clear." He didn't look at the screen. If he had, I'm not sure he would have seen what I did. Maybe the pattern was only for me. A soft hiss behind the privacy curtain to my left made the hairs on my arms prick up. We were the only ones in this part of the medbay. I'd walked past the empty cots on my way in. No one else had checked in for treatment during my scan. Still, there it was, the unmistakable sound of fabric shifting, as if someone had stepped close to the curtain and brushed it with a sleeve. The medtech paused mid-scan, head cocked. "Hear that?" "Yes," I said. He set the scanner down and pulled the curtain back with a practiced flick. The cot behind it lay empty. The pillow had a faint impression, rounded in a way that suggested weight had been there recently. The monitoring leads dangled neatly at the side, unused. The medtech muttered something under his breath and checked the room log. "No patients assigned here." As he focused on the terminal, I stared at the pillow. If I squinted, the indentation looked wrong. Not a simple hollow where a head had rested, but a shape with an extra curve, an elongated depression where something longer than human might have pressed down. The fabric rose slightly at one end, like a weight had shifted there and decided against fully manifesting. I blinked hard. The pillow smoothed out, leaving only a shallow, ordinary hollow. "You okay?" the medtech asked, glancing up. "Just thinking about the walkway," I said. He gave me a sympathetic look. "Space does that to you. We're not built to understand all that empty." Empty wasn't the word I would have chosen. He excused himself to fetch a supplement injection, leaving me alone on the cot. The monitor above ticked on. For a few seconds, my heart and breath traced normal lines. Then the echo returned, clearer than before, overlaying my metrics with its own. I lifted my right hand and held it in front of my face. For a moment, it stayed still. Then the fingers began to move. Not all at once. Not in any pattern I consciously chose. The index finger flexed halfway, stopped, straightened. The ring finger curled in a fraction of a second later. The thumb twitched, rotating at an angle that made my joints ache. I tried to close my hand into a fist. The attempt met resistance, not outside but inside. Some other preference for how the hand should be arranged pushed back, a quiet, insistent suggestion that my bones had more options than I'd been using. On the monitor, the echo trace turned steady while my own heart rate spiked. I forced the fist closed. The muscles responded with a sharp pulse of pain, as if reprimanding me for refusing an offered configuration. The sensation faded slowly, leaving behind a tingling in my fingertips, like currents moving through unfamiliar channels. By the time the medtech returned, my hand lay still on my thigh. "Nothing catastrophic," he said, reviewing the data. "Mild stress markers. I'm logging a recommendation for rest, but we both know you're not going to get it this shift." "I've had worse," I said. He prepared the injection and pressed it against my arm. As the contents flowed into my bloodstream, I felt a spreading warmth that had nothing to do with the reactor hull. It carried a subtle, buzzing undertone, a pharmacological calm layered over something else already humming in my nerves. For a brief, disorienting second, 3 rhythms overlapped inside me. My own exhausted pulse, the manufactured steadiness of the medbay cocktail, and a third, cooler beat that had nothing to do with human biology. The third one felt patient. "Vitals look good," the medtech concluded. "You're cleared to return to duty. Try not to fall off anything." As I slid off the cot and pulled my undersuit sleeve back down, I caught my reflection in the glossy base of a nearby instrument. The face under the tired eyes was mine. The set of the shoulders was mine. But there was a moment, a single jagged instant, as I straightened up when the reflection didn't. It remained seated on the cot, head bowed, as if reluctant to follow. Then it snapped into alignment, the motion compressed and delayed. I looked away first. On my way out of the medbay, my breath finally felt like it belonged to me again. But the memory of borrowing it from someone else lingered, like the aftertaste of a drug that hadn't fully left my system. Relic storage lay deeper in the station, past the familiar bulk of cargo and the honest geometry of ore hoppers. You could feel the shift as you approached, a tightening in the corridors, a subtle change in how the walls carried sound. Officially, it was just another secure zone. Classified materials, sensitive equipment, a few pieces of alien tech routed through for analysis before disappearing into someone else's jurisdiction. Unofficially, everyone walked a little faster past its doors. Control called me there on the way out of the medbay. Field monitors pinged a fluctuation in the vault, they said. Could be another false positive like the CO2 variants. Just put eyes on it. Eyes. As if that would make a difference. The approach corridor narrowed as I went, the ceiling dipping an almost imperceptible amount each few meters. The lights spaced along the overhead panels held their distance on paper, but in practice the gaps felt longer, the shadows between them thicker. My footsteps seemed quieter, as if the metal under the flooring had been damped. At the end of the corridor, the relic vault door waited. Layers of hardened plating framed a recessed security panel. I keyed in the authorization sequence, placed my hand on the scanner, waited for the cold kiss of its analysis. For a heartbeat, the panel stayed dark. Then, with a slow, reluctant glow, the indicator strip turned green. The door began to cycle open. The vault's interior felt larger than it should have been. On the schematics, it was a roughly rectangular room with reinforced walls and a low central ceiling. In person, the proportions refused to settle. The distance between opposite walls stretched and contracted at the edge of my vision. Racks of containment cases and plinths holding sealed artifacts receded into a haze that hadn't been there the last time I'd been inside. I took a step forward and felt the gravity tilt. Not as violently as on the EVA walkway. This was subtler, a gentle sideways encouragement that suggested the floor was no longer level. The muscles in my calves adjusted. My inner ear insisted that down had shifted a few degrees toward the left wall. The vault's primary field generator sat at the far end, encasing the most sensitive items in a layered containment lattice. Its status indicators glowed a steady blue-white. No alarms, no visible distortion. Still, the hair along my arms rose. The relics themselves varied in appearance. Some looked like twisted shards of metal fused with glass, others like smooth stone shot through with metallic veins. A few were nothing more than sealed boxes with hazard markings and classification tags. Two of them didn't match any category I was comfortable with. On a low plinth near the center of the room, a fragment floated a few centimeters above its cradle. It was a curved piece of something not quite metal, not quite crystal, its surface dark, but laced with faint lines of pale light that shifted in patterns too complex to be decorative. The field around it should have been invisible. Instead, the air seemed thicker there, like a lens of denser reality. As I approached, the gravity tug changed direction again. My body wanted to lean toward the fragment, as if it were a small planet. The pull was subtle but real. My steps had to lengthen on one side to compensate. The sensation reminded me of being on the EVA walkway, with the hull trying to slide me outward. Only here the fall was inward, into a point that barely occupied space. "Relic vault on site," I said, my voice sounding thin in the high, still air. "Field generator appears stable, investigating local variants." "Copy," Control replied. Their tone was clipped now, like the static on the line had increased. "We're seeing some noise on the psionic sensor relays. Could be a loop from the relic containment." Psionic. A word we didn't use often, and never casually. I stepped closer to the floating fragment. The lines of light on its surface shifted, tracing shapes that hurt to follow, arcs that almost formed circles but never closed, angles that met at impossibly precise fractions. My right arm moved without my permission. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden jerk, no flailing. It simply lifted, elbow straightening, hand extending toward the relic. The motion was smooth, deliberate, utterly absent of my intent. For a second, I didn't fight it. Some deep, quiet part of me wanted to know where the gesture would end. My fingers spread, arranging themselves into that half-remembered configuration they'd been reaching for since the cargo bay. This time, the shape completed. Joints aligned into a pattern that felt both alien and inevitable. A lattice of bone and tendon that fit the shifting lines on the relic's surface like a key sliding toward a lock. Heat bloomed along my arm, a slow, steady warmth that wasn't mine. Then I wrenched control back. The effort was not like moving a cramped muscle. It was like pushing against another mind that had already decided how my body should behave. Every centimeter of retreat felt negotiated. The shape of my hand resisted, bones aching as they unfolded from the imposed pattern. On the plinth, the fragment brightened, the lines on its surface flaring in a slow, pulsing rhythm. "Field spike," Control said. Their voice came through with a shimmer of static. "We're reading a resonance from relic A17. Do you have eyes on it?" "I see it," I said, teeth clenched. "It's active." "Any physical discharge? Radiation? EM?" I checked my suit's instruments. The readings fluttered but stayed below critical thresholds. No arcs, no visible energy, just light and gravity that refused to behave. "Nothing hostile," I said. "Not yet." Not yet hung in the air between us. Beyond the plinths, something moved. I turned my head slowly, careful not to offer any sudden motions the fragment might try to borrow. Near the far wall, where the containment racks grew taller and the ceiling seemed farther away than it should have been, the light bent. It wasn't a trick of the fixtures. Those remained steady. It was the paths the photons chose. They curved around a region of space the shape of a standing figure, the way water flows around a stone in a current. The distortion was subtler than what I'd seen on the hull, but more defined. It had edges now, a suggestion of shoulders, of arms hanging at the sides. Where a head might have been, the air shimmered with a tight, controlled halo of refraction. For a heartbeat, the vault felt like a chapel. Not a human one, not with pews or altars, a place built for a different kind of reverence, where standing in the presence of something unseen required stillness. The fragment's glow synced to an invisible rhythm. Each flare of light on its surface matched a pulse in the distortion by the wall. Between them, the gravity in the room shifted minutely, tugging at my center of mass in faint, synchronized nudges. My heart responded, trying to find a beat that fit between the pulls. My hand lifted again, on its own. This time the motion stopped halfway. Not because I'd arrested it, but because something else had. A counter-command arrived from a direction I couldn't name, holding my arm in a poised, half-offered angle. The sense of being observed intensified. Not from outside, not through cameras or sensors, from the inside out, like someone had stepped into my skull and was looking out through my eyes, evaluating whether this body would do. Near the far wall for an instant, a slender crescent of brighter light appeared at about chest height within the distortion. It was smaller than the gleam I'd seen by the hull, but sharper, as if drawn with more intent. A blade, or the memory of one. "Field levels are spiking again," Control said. Their voice fuzzed with interference. "If it looks unstable, you need to clear out. That's an order." I swallowed, the motion dry and loud in my own ears. "The containment holds," I said. "But there's interaction. The relics are resonating with something in the room." "What something?" I watched the distortion by the wall shift, not stepping closer, but refining its boundaries. The space it occupied felt more solid by the second. "Unknown," I said. "Recommend updating the classification from inert artifact to active psionic interface." The phrase tasted like paperwork and fear. The gravity tug eased. My arm, freed from the half gesture, dropped back to my side with a boneless heaviness that made me want to sit down. Sensation returned in tingling waves, like a limb that had fallen asleep. On the plinth, the fragment's light dimmed to a low, steady glow. Whatever conversation it had been having with the distortion seemed to conclude. The figure-shaped refraction by the wall thinned. The light straightened, reclaiming its usual paths. In the span of a breath, mine this time, the unseen presence folded itself back into the vault's geometry, leaving only the memory of a shape where emptiness should have been. "Field fluctuation is dropping," Control reported, sounding relieved and annoyed in equal measure. "We're back in acceptable range. Log everything you saw and get out of there." I looked one last time at the floating fragment. The lines of light on its surface lay quiet now, but I couldn't shake the impression that they were not finished with me. The pattern my hand had tried to form was still there in my nerves, like a song I almost remembered. "Understood," I said. As I turned to leave, the gravity shifted one final time, a brief, almost playful nudge toward the plinth, like a farewell or a promise. The vault door closed behind me with a deep, resonant thud that carried farther down the corridor than sound had any right to travel. Inside my chest, my heart beat its own rhythm for a few precious seconds. Then, faintly, something else tapped along with it, half a beat behind, waiting for its chance to lead. The first thing I noticed was the vibration in my teeth. Not the usual low thrumming of the station's pumps or the deep structural hum of the reactor. This was finer, a high, steady tremor that seemed to live in the enamel itself. By the time I realized it wasn't just nerves, I was already halfway down the ladder well that led to the mining level. The ladder rungs were cool under my gloves, colder than the air. Each time I shifted my weight, the metal gave a faint, delayed shiver, as if the station were reconsidering the decision to hold me up. Light bled down the shaft in thin, uneven bands from the decks above, failing to reach the bottom. After the vault, Control had done what they always did with things they didn't understand. Rerouted me somewhere familiar and told themselves it was normal work. Mining tunnels are registering minor seismic noise, they'd said. Might be machinery, might be settling. Take a look, log it, move on. Settling. As if anything out here had the right to settle. My boots hit the lower deck with a dull, off-tempo thud. The corridor to the tunnels yawned ahead, lined with overhead rails for ore carts and emergency lamps that rarely had to earn their keep. The air was thicker here, infused with dust and the faint, metallic tang of exposed rock. As I walked, the fine vibration in my teeth synced with my steps. One tiny buzz for each heel strike, like a counter keeping time. The access door to Tunnel B3 recognized my ID with unusual eagerness. The lock cycles barely finished before the panel flashed green. Someone had reduced the safety delay without logging it, or something had decided we didn't need that extra heartbeat anymore. The door slid aside. Tunnel air had its own flavor: rock dust, coolant from the cutting rigs, trace minerals the filters never quite caught. I stepped over the threshold, and the station's usual geometry fell away. On the schematics, Tunnel B3 extended in a gentle curve, following a vein of ore. In person, the curve fought with my eyes. The walls seemed to bend in two directions at once, like I was looking down a corridor, slowly being twisted by invisible hands. The strip lights bolted to the ceiling vibrated in place, a faint, trembling shimmer that didn't match any known frequency. I took 3 steps before I realized my legs had started moving without me. It wasn't dramatic. My feet landed where they were supposed to, knees bending at the correct angles. But the decision to continue walking hadn't arisen from the familiar place in my mind where such things usually started. It had arrived as a finished fact. You are moving forward. I stopped. My body obeyed, eventually. The delay was small, barely enough to notice. But the space between intent and response was widening, like a crack in a bulkhead. Behind me, the door hissed shut. The sound bounced down the tunnel, then came back, altered. Not an echo of the wordless noise, but the echo of a different sound entirely, something like a footfall in softer material. Mining level reached, I reported, my voice sounding too loud in the narrow space. Experiencing structural vibration in the tunnel, proceeding with inspection. Control's reply reached me with a slight phase shift, as if the words had taken 2 paths to my ears and arrived a fraction of a second out of sync. Copy. Seismic sensors are quiet topside. Might be localized equipment. There was no equipment running down here. As I advanced, the tunnel tightened, the ceiling dipping just enough to make me conscious of it. The lights overhead flickered, but not in the usual random way of failing connections. They pulsed in a sequence. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Like an unfamiliar heartbeat trying to learn a rhythm. A fresh branch cut into the rock opened on my right. a narrower bore that hadn't been there on my last inspection. The mapping overlay in my visor insisted it didn't exist. The line work showed solid rock, where my eyes saw a passable tunnel. My right leg shifted, knee angling toward the new passage. I hadn't chosen to turn. I forced my weight back to center, calf muscles protesting. For a moment, it felt like my body contained two sets of instructions overlapping, one charting a straight course along B3 to the sensor nodes, another cutting sideways toward the fresh bore with blind confidence. The fine vibration in my teeth climbed into my skull, settling behind my eyes. Something moved ahead, around a slight bend. It wasn't sound or light, not at first. It was an adjustment in the space. The way the air changed when someone else entered a room you'd thought was empty. Tunnel dust hung suspended in the beams of the overhead lamps. And for an instant, those motes traced the outline of a tall shape where no rock stood. A column of mild absence, as if the tunnel's volume had forgotten to include itself there. My right foot took a step forward on its own. The shape remained still. It had no edges I could define, just gradients of distortion, like heat above a fire in a gravity well that couldn't decide which way to pull. Somewhere near where a shoulder might have been, dust swirled in a tight spiral, then drifted out of phase with the rest of the tunnel air. I tried to speak and found my jaw unwilling to move. The muscles along my neck had gone taut without my permission. The thing in the tunnel took a step. I didn't see the footfall, not directly. I saw the effect. Dust sliding aside, rock grain shimmering along the wall as if brushed by a passing field. The movement covered exactly the distance between the distortion and the angle where the tunnel narrowed. My body matched it. My left foot moved forward, precisely the same length of stride. My hips shifted, shoulders rolling, head tilting by a fractional degree. It was like being a reflection forced to stay in the mirror while the original walked through the room. For 3 steps, we moved together. The tunnel around us stretched. The lights overhead swam in my vision, resolving into elongated streaks that refused to line up with the physical fixtures. My visor's depth indicators stuttered, unable to fix a reliable range to the far wall. Then, where the distortion's head should have been, something flashed. A longer curve of brighter nothing, too sharp to be empty, swung through the stale air. It wasn't a weapon cut. No stone fell, no sparks flew. It was a test swing, a measured arc as if reacquainting itself with gravity. The suggestion of a blade singing in a register my ears couldn't quite catch. My right arm rose in perfect synchrony, hand flexing into that now familiar alien pattern. In the cramped space of the tunnel, with rock close on either side, it didn't look like a gesture of contact. It looked like a salute. The sensation of being watched no longer came from outside my skin. It was inside my joints, behind my eyes, at the base of my tongue. Each piece of me had an observer now, taking notes, adjusting settings. When the distortion halted, so did I. The tunnel seemed to hold its breath. Time stretched. Or maybe it didn't, and only my perception did. The vibration in my skull ceased for a moment. In the sudden absence of it, I realized how completely it had filled the background of my thoughts. Then the choice arrived. It didn't come as words. It came as a split screen in my mind, 2 futures laid over each other. In one, I turned and retreated, hand whimpering back into a human configuration, the tunnel shrinking behind me to the size it had always been. In the other, I took one more step forward, just one, and let my body continue to mirror whatever walked ahead. Only one of those futures had any weight. I chose the first one. Not because it was safer, I didn't believe that anymore, but because I wanted, stubbornly, to prove I could still choose at all. I dragged my foot back. The motion felt like pulling it out of thick mud. Pain flared along my hip and into my spine, bright and electric. The distortion shivered, lines of bent light around it tightening, then loosening as if recalculating. My arm dropped, fingers cramping as they tried to hold the alien pattern and failed. The tunnel snapped back into more ordinary proportions. The lights overhead became individual fixtures again instead of streaks. The fine vibration in my teeth resumed, angrier now, like a reprimand. The distortion remained where it was for one last beat, distance between us now fixed again. Then it stepped sideways, not away from me, but out of the tunneling completely, dissolving into rock that hadn't been cut, through strata that didn't know what to do with such trespass. Dust drifted back to normal. Behind me, the access door to B3 cycled open on its own, the locked tones echoing down the tunnel in a sequence I hadn't triggered. An invitation or an instruction. It was hard to tell. "Seismic noise is dropping," Control said in my ear. "We're reading baseline again. Anything to report?" I looked at the place where the distortion had been, at my hands, at the narrow branch the map refused to admit existed. "Local anomaly resolved," I said. "No structural damage, recommending a temporary closure for recalibration." "That's not going to happen," Control replied, but their voice sounded farther away now, muffled by more than just distance. On the climb back up the ladder well, my movements felt slightly out of sequence. Muscles would twitch a fraction of a second before I decided to use them, a body warming up to a routine it had already learned from someone else. By the time I reached the main level, my teeth had stopped vibrating. Inside my chest, something else had picked up the rhythm. The station went quiet before the alarms ever sounded. It was in the little things first. The distant clatter of ore carts cut off between one breath and the next. The overlapping chatter of pumps thinned, leaving gaps of silence where machinery should have been complaining. Even the familiar creak of the hull adjusting to thermal stress seemed to pause, as if the whole structure were listening. I was halfway to the reactor hall when Control's voice broke over the channel, thin and edged. "We've got a hard spike on the psionic relays and a transient power dip across multiple decks. External sensors are blind on one arc. We need eyes at the forward airlock now. Forward airlock, not the one tied to routine transfers. The emergency lock near the observation level, reserved for situations no one wanted to define too clearly." "On my way," I said. The corridors between me and the airlock felt longer than they had any right to. The overhead lights stayed on, but their glow had developed a direction, as if illumination had become a fluid someone was dragging forward through the station. I moved in that current, following the brighter path. As I passed the junction that led toward the vault, gravity slid sideways for the space of a single step, nudging me away from that route. Not a suggestion, a correction. By the time I reached the airlock antechamber, the sense of being guided had become impossible to ignore. The forward airlock sat in a wedge of the station's hull that jutted toward open space. Its inner door was a thick slab of composite, its outer counterpart invisible from here. Wall panels housed suit racks, tether reels, emergency beacons. Half the suits were already online. Not occupied, just awake. Helmet lamps glowed in standby mode, faceplates reflecting the room in dull, shifting fragments. One suit near the center had powered itself fully, visor polarized, status indicators pulsing, seals cycling as if anticipating a body. Mine. The ID tag on its chest plate matched my assignment code. It shouldn't have spun up without a manual command. "This lock's showing autonomous prep," I said, though I already knew Control would deny it. "Suit 11 is active without user input." "We don't have control of that panel," they answered. "Something's riding the circuit. Just get inside and we'll cut power if we have to." If we have to. I stepped toward the suit. My legs didn't hesitate this time. Whatever had been tentative in the tunnels had gained confidence. My movements felt optimized, like someone had pared away wasted motion. As I slid into the hard shell, the inner surfaces met my body with the familiarity of long use. But there was a difference in the fit. The joints anticipated angles I hadn't intended to take yet. The fingers in the gauntlets settled into resting positions closer to that alien pattern than any human posture should have called neutral. The helmet sealed with a hiss. For a heartbeat, the world went black. In that darkness, I wasn't sure whose lungs drew the first breath. When the suit's systems booted fully, my visor filled with the usual overlays: oxygen levels, external pressure readings, lock status. Overlaid on top of them, faint and flickering, another set of data traced itself. Curves and glyphs I didn't recognize. Mapping vectors not represented in any station diagram. Lines of attention, maybe, or intent. The inner hatch cycled open. The lock chamber beyond was a narrow cylinder with handholds along the walls and a small observation slit facing forward. Through that slit, I could usually see a slice of the hull and a scatter of stars. Now, the stars were gone. Something pressed against the outer side of the slit. Not physically. There was no impact, no rasp of metal on glass. But the field of vision beyond had been occluded by a gradient of darkness not explained by simple shadow. Light from the station's own navigation beacons skated along its edge and bent away, leaving a curved line of absence. My tether clipped itself to the ring beside the hatch. I hadn't lifted my hand, but the system registered a completed coupling all the same. "Outer sensors in that arc are completely blind," Control said. "We're picking up a null signature. No stars, no debris, no emissions, just nothing. Confirm visual." "I confirm," I said. The words felt thin. The lock's pumps kicked in, drawing the air out. As the pressure dropped, a strange calm settled over me. The panic that should have followed being trapped between two untrustworthy doors simply didn't arrive. Something else stood in that space. A presence filling the mental room where my fear used to live. The outer hatch cycled. There was no rush of wind. There never is if the systems are working. Just the soft thunk of seal clamps disengaging and the status indicator shifting from red to green. Beyond the opening, the EVA platform lay exposed to stars I couldn't see. A narrow lip of metal, safety tethers, guide rails. The walkway wrapped around the hull toward the region that had gone dark to our instruments. My boots crossed the threshold. Outside, the absence had texture. Not visually. My visor still registered no data beyond a shallow cone of normality around the station. But my other senses, those I'd never had cause to name, felt something like wind in a place where no air moved. Currents of attention, sliding over the hull, pooling in hollows, curling around protrusions. And around me, the fine adjustment of gravity I'd felt before returned. But now it wasn't a flicker. It was a constant, gentle pull from a single direction, forward, toward the blind sector. My tether line tightened, but not from slack I'd given it. It had shortened itself, reeling me in. Somewhere ahead, a distortion waited, no longer content to be a suggestion in peripheral vision. I rounded the curve of the hull. The darkness resolved, not into an object exactly, but into an area where the universe refused to be rendered. Stars at the edge of my visor's field of view flowed around it like dust in a magnetic field. The shape at its core matched what I'd felt in the tunnels and the vault, but more defined now, more confident in its claim on space. A tall figure, standing just off the hull, cloaked in refraction. Lines of bent light traced the approximate outline of limbs and torso. The airless void around it rippled as if reacting to heat that couldn't exist out here. At about shoulder height, an arm angled downward, ending in a curve of concentrated distortion that caught what little stray light reached it and turned it into a razor-thin, pale gleam. The blade. Seeing it directly was worse than the glimpses. It made the rest of the shape real. I stopped, but my shadow did not. On the hull beside me, where the suit's silhouette should have stretched in a clean line from my boots, it detached. The outline of my body, rendered in flattened light against the metal, stepped out of position. It peeled away from my current stance and took a half step forward, aligning itself with the invisible figure ahead. I didn't move. The shadow did. It raised its right arm, hand fingers arranging themselves into that too precise pattern, mirroring the unseen limb beyond the hull's edge. For a moment, I knew with absolute clarity that if the shadow completed the gesture, the rest of me would follow. The choice that had been mine in the tunnel no longer belonged to me. Inside my skull, the sense of observation shifted. It was no longer someone looking out through my eyes to study the station. It was a gaze turned inward, assessing proportions, calibrating nerves, measuring tolerances. The blade out in the dark angled slightly. Its point didn't aim at my body. It aligned with the space just behind my sternum, the place where my breath had stopped feeling entirely my own. In that alignment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to name. This had never been a hunt in the simple sense. Not prey and predator, not trespasser and territory. It was selection, evaluation, a craftsman picking up tools, weighing their balance. The station, the relics, the tunnels, the medbay. All of it had been context for a single question. Would this particular arrangement of flesh and bone and fear serve as a suitable conduit? My shadow's hand completed its motion. There was no impact when the blade moved. No sound. It simply slid forward through the portion of darkness it owned, through the small gulf of vacuum between us, and through the silhouette pinned to the hull. My chest spasmed. Not in pain, there was no wound. The suit integrity remained intact. All the metrics stayed green. But something inside me shifted by a tiny distance, the way a bone might settle more comfortably into a socket. For a heartbeat, my own pulse vanished from my awareness. In its place, a colder rhythm took over, precise and unfaltering, stretching out in all directions at once. I saw, not with my eyes, but with some new axis of perception, the station as a thin shell around a bright knot of thinking matter. I saw the tunnels as veins, the reactor as a heart, the relic vault as a strange, foreign organ grafted in. And outside, I saw the figure in full. Not details, not the face. I will never have the language for the face, but the posture, the poise, the economy of motion. A being who had spent lifetimes walking in the dark between stars. Blade, a natural extension of thought. Our perspectives overlapped for 3 breaths. In that overlap, identity became a negotiation. Memories of things I had never experienced pulsed at the edges of my mind. Alien landscapes under shattered skies. War fought in blue fire and absence. A long exile embraced instead of resented. In return, my own memories were sampled, scrutinized, weighed, set aside or kept. Short human years flickered past from an impossible angle. Then the overlap narrowed. The blade withdrew from my shadow. The figure in the dark stepped back, its outline thinning as it folded itself once more into the patterns of bent starlight. The null zone around it began to diffuse, stars flowing back into the space like a tide returning. But the separation was not clean. My shadow did not slide back to match my stance. It lingered halfway, caught between the position it had taken and the one my body currently held. When I moved, it followed with a visible delay now, an afterimage that refused to fully sink. Inside my chest, my heart started beating loud and fast again, reasserting itself in flesh. Under it, quieter but steady, the borrowed rhythm continued, pulsing in a layer of self I hadn't known existed. "External null signature is fading," Control said, their voice distant, distorted by more than interference. "Sensors are coming back online. Status?" I looked at the stars, now where they were supposed to be. At the hull, now merely metal, at the lingering misalignment at my feet. "Contact resolved," I said. My voice sounded almost normal. "No physical damage to the platform, no visible hull breach." There was a pause. "And you?" I watched my hand lift, just a fraction, fingers twitching toward that pattern. Not fully, not all at once, just enough to remind me that the option remained. "I'm still here," I said. It was true as far as it went. On the walk back to the airlock, my tether relaxed, but not entirely. It maintained a gentle, unnecessary tension, as if ready to pull me back into position at a thought from somewhere beyond my reach. Inside, the lock cycled closed. Air rushed in, systems hummed. The normal sounds of the station resumed, filling the silence like apologetic chatter after an awkward pause. When I finally stepped out of the suit and caught my reflection in the antechamber's brushed metal wall, it looked like me. Same eyes, same lines of wear, same tired stoop. I raised my hand. The reflection raised its too, but in the mirrored surface, for the briefest moment, there were 2 hands, mine, and a second superimposed just out of alignment, fingers longer, angles sharper, arranged in a gesture that wasn't quite human or Protoss or anything I had words for. Then the second hand blinked out, leaving only mine. The station creaked around me, alive and ignorant. Somewhere out beyond the hull, in the darkness that had briefly known my name from the inside, something turned away to hunt elsewhere. But it hadn't left empty-handed. It had taken the part of me that believed my body had ever been entirely my own.